Robert Wagner has been named a person of interest in the death of his wife, legendary actress Natalie Wood.
I've stayed silent for too long, but I can't live with that fear anymore. At 61, Robert Wagner's only daughter finally speaks the truth about the night that took her mother's life, the legendary Natalie Wood. For 40 years, she lived in silence, surrounded by family photos taken down from the walls by questions no one dared to ask, and by the cold eyes of a powerful father revered by all of Hollywood. But the memory of that night never let her go. The sound of crashing waves, the whistling wind, and the image of her mother in a nightgown trembling as she stepped onto the deck amid the storm. My mother was afraid of water. She always said it would swallow her whole, but it was my father who forced her onto that boat that night. That statement was an explosion. It didn't just break a family silence. It reopened one of Hollywood's deepest wounds, the death of Natalie Wood accident or something long concealed. And this time the storyteller is not the police, not the press, but their daughter. The one who witnessed, who feared, and who has now decided to speak it all aloud. 1. Every time I close my eyes, I still hear the scream of my mother. Then the sound of things breaking, and after that silence, a silence as cold as death. The daughter spoke in broken breaths, her eyes dimming beneath 40 years of memory. Though time may blur everything else, that night still rises in her mind so vivid it chills. The daughter spoke in a trembling voice, eyes misting, as if seeing again the terrifying night of 1981, the night her life veered forever in another direction. It was the evening of November 28, 1981, on Santa Catalina Island, about 35 kilometers off the California coast. The Wagner family yacht Splendor was moored in the coldest, windiest waters. That afternoon, the weather turned to rain, the wind gusting harder and harder. Natalie Wood begged her husband, actor Robert Wagner, not to go out to sea in the storm. She spoke softly, her voice shaking. "I have a bad feeling, Robert. Can we go in the morning instead?" But Wagner only gave a thin smile, poured more wine, and said flatly, "Don't be foolish. It's just a short trip." He had made up his mind, and no one dared argue. That night, there were 4 people on the yacht: Robert Wagner, Natalie Wood co-star Christopher Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern. The boat left the marina at about 7:30 p.m. as the winter wind began to rise. The sea was ink dark, the sky covered with gray clouds, and the waves struck the hull with a heavy thud. Natalie Wood had feared water since childhood. Her closest friends said she would tremble whenever she saw the ocean at night. In her diary, she once wrote a line that later felt prophetic. "If I die because of the water, believe it wasn't an accident." But that night she couldn't refuse. Wagner had been drinking, and his blind anger made everyone afraid. Around 10 p.m., the air in the cabin grew heavy. Glasses were constantly refilled. Walken later said Wagner started to grow jealous when he saw his wife talking too closely with him. He stared at Walken, then turned to Natalie, his voice thick with alcohol. "You think I don't see it? How you look at him?" Natalie tried to stay calm, tried to soothe him, but tears had already fallen. "Robert, you're drunk. Please stop." Walken stayed silent, stood up, and went to the deck to avoid the argument. Captain Dennis Davern was near the galley then. He heard a chair scrape hard, then a heavy thud against the wall, followed by the crash of glass. A few seconds later came a woman's scream, panicked. "Don't touch me!" Davern started about to run in when Robert Wagner stepped out, face-flushed eyes blazing. He blocked the doorway and barked, "Nothing's happening. Get back to the engine room." His tone was hard-edged with threat. Davern froze, afraid to argue, hearing only wind and rain slamming the hull. About 15 minutes later, when Davern returned to the cabin, Wagner was sitting alone, his face like stone. He said quietly, "She's gone. Maybe out on deck to look at the moon." But that night, the sky had no moon, only black clouds and lightning. Davern immediately checked around the boat, calling Natalie's name, but no one answered. When he swept his flashlight across the deck, he saw the small lifeboat was gone. "She must have headed for shore," Wagner said casually. Davern was stunned, nearly choking. Who could row alone to land in a stormy night like that? He suggested sending a distress signal, but Wagner stopped him. "No need to make a fuss. She'll be back." For the hours that followed, the yacht sank into silence. Walken sat in a corner, head in his hands, while Wagner drank quietly, staring into the endless black of the sea. Wind whistled through the rails, waves struck like the ticking of seconds. Davern remembered he had never felt a silence so frightening. Around 7 a.m. on November 29, 1981, the Coast Guard received a belated call from the Splendor. As the sun edged over the horizon, Natalie Wood's body was found floating about a mile south of Catalina. She wore a thin wine-red nightgown, her hair tangled bare feet, her wrists scratched, and her arms bruised. Her eyes were closed, her face still etched with fear. Robert Wagner stood on deck when his wife's body was brought aboard. He said only briefly, "I don't know what happened." No tears, no trembling hands. He turned away, his face unmoved, as if the woman were a stranger. The police took his statement while Captain Davern stood still, hands shaking, carrying the guilt of not breaking that night's silence. Years later, when she spoke again, Natalie's daughter still couldn't sleep whenever she heard waves. "I hear my mother, I hear him." "And then there's only silence," she said. "That silence has haunted me my whole life." The night of November 28, 1981, the last night of Natalie Wood, became a nightmare, not only for one family but for all of Hollywood. A stormy night, a woman gone, and a powerful man choosing silence. 2. The first time I dared to look at my mother's case file, I couldn't breathe. Each line was like a blade. My mother's body, the most beautiful woman of my life, listed as cold evidence: bruises, scratches, injuries. The daughter said this with trembling hands as she turned the yellowed document sealed since 1981, the year the world called Natalie Wood's death a tragic accident. But to her, it was never an accident. The autopsy, dated November 30th, 1981, in Los Angeles County, recorded more than 30 bruises on Natalie's arms, legs, neck, and back. Some were shaped like fingers, as if someone had gripped, pulled, or struggled with her. The examiner also noted that the timing of the injuries lined up with when she went missing from the yacht around 11 p.m. on November 28th. That meant Natalie had suffered strong impact before entering the water. Yet the final conclusion in the official report was accident due to loss of balance while intoxicated. A dry, easy conclusion, and to many, unsettlingly implausible. A couple living near the Catalina moorings later stated they heard arguing and objects falling from the direction of the Splendor around 11:30 p.m. The wife said, "We also heard a woman screaming. Then a man shouted, and everything went silent." But their statement never appeared in the public file. Police said it was unverifiable. The husband later told the press that an officer had visited them and advised, "Don't get involved in celebrity matters." Natalie's daughter was 8 at the time, but the memory of her mother coming home with bruises on her face never faded. She remembered asking, "Did you fall?" Mom and her mother only smiled and whispered, "It's okay. Don't tell anyone." Now, reading the autopsy, she finally understood what "it's okay" had meant. It was how a woman hid her fear, trying to protect her child from the harshest truth. The pain came from the husband admired by all of Hollywood. Those close to Natalie said that a few months before she died, she had sought a lawyer to file for divorce. In a private conversation, she told a close friend, "He's not the Robert I once loved. He controls me, watches me, threatens me. If I leave, he'll make me disappear for real." That friend later appeared on a TV program in 2002 and cried as she recalled the line, "I didn't think it would be a farewell." But the 1981 investigation was quickly closed. In less than a week, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office announced there was no sign of wrongdoing, and the cause of death was recorded as accidental drowning. Hollywood publications at the time ran photos of Robert Wagner in black, in dark glasses, head bowed by his wife's casket like a man shattered by loss. No one dared to question further. Then, time went on. Robert kept acting, appeared on talk shows, received honorary awards, and was invited to write a memoir. They all had one thing in common he never spoke of that night. Until 2011, 30 years after Natalie Wood's death, when the Los Angeles police unexpectedly reopened the case. The reason came from new testimony by Captain Dennis Davern. He admitted he had lied in his first statement because he was under pressure. He said that night Wagner and Natalie had a fierce argument. He heard her scream, heard crashing sounds, and then Wagner ordered him not to leave the helm. When he refused, Wagner warned, "This is my boat. Do as I say or get off." Police re-examined the scene, compared old and new testimony, and reviewed the injuries. And finally, in February 2018, Robert Wagner was officially listed as a person of interest in the death of Natalie Wood. Even so, he was never charged. And as always, he chose silence. When she heard the case was reopened, Natalie's daughter said she sat in her room looking at her mother's photo on the wall, tears falling without end. "My mother cried out that night, and no one helped her. Now they've all spoken, only he stays silent. I don't need anyone punished. I just want the world to know my mother did not fall into the water she was pushed." That line left the host silent. In the studio, no one even dared to breathe, because after 40 years, the truth no longer lay still. At the bottom of Catalina, it was rising with the voice of a daughter who grew up in silence and a pain that never closed. 3. On the day my mother was buried, Los Angeles was unusually cold. I stood a few steps from him watching as he didn't shed a single tear. People said my father was in pain, but all I saw was him staring at the casket, then turning away, as if he wanted to escape the gaze of the one who was gone. It was December 3rd, 1981. Natalie Wood's funeral took place at Westwood Memorial Park, the resting place of many Hollywood stars. Under a gray sky, the crowd was silent, broken only by the constant click of cameras. Robert Wagner wore a black coat and dark glasses, his face unreadable. He stood before the casket, said nothing, didn't bow his head, his eyes fixed in a vacant stare. Many thought it was the grief of a widower. But to the little girl standing behind him, it was a different look, cold, empty, and frighteningly strange. After the funeral, the house in Beverly Hills where Natalie had once filled every room with fresh flowers and film music each morning fell into an eerie quiet. Every photo of Natalie was taken down. Her records were put away. The private room where she used to write her diary was locked. Inside the house, the name Natalie was not to be spoken. One evening, the daughter asked her father, "Why did Mom die?" "Dad." He set down his glass, looked straight into her eyes, and answered slowly, as if reading a memorized line. "Some things are better left unknown." Then he stood up and walked away, leaving the child sitting in silence, eyes brimming. From that day on, She no longer called him Dad. Between them rose a wall of silence no one could break. A few months later, she moved out to live with an aunt in San Francisco. In her small suitcase, she carried only one photo of her mother in a red dress, the only picture left that he hadn't removed. I hid it in my coat. If he'd found it, he would have torn it up, she recalled, voice tight. The 1980s passed, and Hollywood kept shining. Robert Wagner returned to work, appearing at ceremonies, talk shows, and charity events. The press called him the brave man after tragedy, a model of poise and strength. He smiled. For the cameras, shook hands with colleagues, and appeared in television series like Heart to Heart and NCIS. But to the daughter, each smile was a cut. He may fool Hollywood, but he can't fool his own daughter, she said. When she turned 18, she returned to Los Angeles for college. Once she happened to see her father on a TV interview. The host asked, "Do you still think about Natalie Wood?" Wagner smiled lightly and replied, "Of course, she will always be part of my heart." She switched off the TV, threw the remote to the floor, and burst into tears. He's lying. He's lying to the whole world. The older she grew, the more she understood the price of silence. She began rereading old articles, studying scene photos, listening to recordings of Captain Davern's interviews. Every detail, every account seemed to confirm what she had sensed as a child. The truth had been hidden, and the one who hid it was her father. In 1993, when Robert remarried actress Jill Saint, John she refused to attend. The press called the wedding a new beginning for Wagner, but to her it was the end of my family. She cut off contact, legally took her mother's surname, and avoided any event connected to her father. In the 2000s, Wagner published the memoir Pieces of My Heart, recounting his life career and enduring love for Natalie Wood. The book sold well and was praised as sincere. But the daughter said that when she reached the chapter about her mother, she had to stop midway. He wrote that my mother left in an accident, that they once loved each other deeply. But there wasn't a single line about the bruises, the screams, or the fear she lived with before she died. Time passed. The father grew older, gray hair, a lined face. But that look, the stone-cold gaze of the past, never changed. In 2011, when the case was reopened, the press went to him. Wagner said only one sentence: "I have nothing more to add." And that was it. No denial, no admission, just a long silence, as in the decades before. By then, in her 50s, she watched her father on television, his eyes still unreadable. "I think he'll take that secret to the grave," she said. "Maybe what hurts me most isn't what he did, but the silence. His silence made my mother die a second time." More than 40 years later, Robert Wagner still lives in the Beverly Hills house, the place that was once their home. And each time she passes that neighborhood, she sees a warm yellow light spilling from a second-floor window, her mother's old room. I imagine him still sitting there, pouring a drink, staring into emptiness. Perhaps on quiet nights, he too hears the waves of Catalina return. She said softly in a recent interview, "I'm not angry anymore. I just regret that some people choose silence for life, even when the truth is knocking at their door." Number 4. The day I got the call from the LA County Sheriff's Office in February 2012, I froze in a parking lot in Santa Monica, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys. They said they wanted to meet me in Marina del Rey because there were new details about the night of 11/28/29/1981. She spoke in a lowered voice, as if afraid to wake a sleeping animal in her chest. For 40 years, she had learned to live with silence, not asking, not speaking, not touching anything tied to Catalina. But the name Catalina returned sharp as a blade, slicing through the calloused skin of years of avoidance. The interview room at the marina was cold and smelled of salt. An investigator opened a dark brown file and slid a stack of yellowed pages toward her. "We want to hear it in your own words." She saw the map of the moorings, a photo of the Splendor, a red underline 233015, the quiet gap. She let out a rough, humorless laugh. Yes, the quiet gap. Then, for the first time in her life, she told how that night, amid the whistle of wind and the waves tapping the hull, she heard her mother scream as if falling from an invisible stair, and then the pounding, the shattering glass, and emptiness. I heard it, but I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet for 40 years. She spoke of fear, the kind with no shape, only sound a man's footsteps on wooden floors, keys clinking together, a door closing very slowly, as if someone held it back so it wouldn't make a noise. She grew up by memorizing the shortest path from her bedroom to the back door by learning the smell of alcohol in the hallway, as if it were a dictation lesson. Years later in therapy, the doctor asked her, "What are you most afraid of?" She answered, "I'm afraid I'll become silent too." The answer startled her. She had long thought she feared him, the water, the night. It turned out what choked her most was the thought that nothing would ever be spoken. A police officer asked softly, "Has he ever admitted anything to you?" She looked out the window where seagulls traced slow circles over the docks, then nodded. She told of an evening in the early 1990s in the old Beverly Hills kitchen. He came home late, heavy with drink, and sank into a chair like a weighted shadow. Without meeting her eyes, he said quietly in broken pieces, "If I hadn't lost my temper that night, she might still be alive." In her memory, the sentence was both an apology that never formed and a way to shift the burden, a dark ball falling from adult hands into a child's. She caught it and carried it silently for life. After the meeting in Marina del Rey, she returned to her small apartment on San Vicente. That night, she climbed to the attic and pulled down a battered cardboard box labeled Family, 1970s. Among faded Polaroids and mementos, she found a red leather notebook with peeling edges. Inside was her mother's familiar slanted hand dishes. She loved to cook lines marked for a roll brief notes about sleepless nights. And on the last page, a sentence cut into the paper like a blade, "He will never let me go." She laid 2 fingers on the line and felt her own pulse travel into the page. No one in the family had ever mentioned this notebook. Perhaps because everything of her mother's had been cleared away, and this, for some reason, slipped through. In the days that followed, she began to take her life apart, like a clock, the minute hand, the hour hand, the tiny gears of memory. She called one of her mother's friends, now elderly in Palm Springs. The woman sighed on the line. "There were nights she called me and said she was afraid. She said she couldn't bear doors slamming." She folded the phone and held her head. Each confirmation felt like a small pin, not ending her at once, but keeping her aching long enough to know she was still alive. She decided to speak, not because she believed justice would arrive, but because she knew silence had been wearing her down piece by piece. In 2012, she signed a statement, her voice hoarse as she read, "That night, I heard my mother scream and my father smashing things. Every word snagged in her throat." She stepped out of the building. The Los Angeles sky was suddenly clear, the palms swaying lightly. She thought, "I've started to breathe." But awakening doesn't come in a single day. It's a tiring journey mornings when she woke rigid as wood from a dream tasting of salt. Afternoons when she stopped cold in a supermarket at the crash of a glass from somewhere. calls she didn't pick up when the press paired her name with his. Once a producer invited her to a Hollywood Memories program promising to tell everything in a beautiful and safe way. She smiled. Truth isn't beautiful, and it's even less safe. She trained herself to speak without resentment. The therapist taught her to count breaths, to name feelings, fear, anger, regret, shame. "How do you feel when you call him father?" the therapist asked. She was silent, then shook her head. "I have no word." Instead, she learned to say her mother's name louder, clearer, as if drawing the departed close. "Mom, I will tell it." One afternoon in 2025, she stepped into a studio in Burbank. Soft lights, thick soundproofing, a blue velvet chair set at center like an island. The host whispered, "Speak in your own way." She nodded. When the red light came on, she looked straight into the lens through the glass to the 8-year-old standing in the old hallway. Her voice was not loud, not shaking, only slow and clear. "I'm not seeking justice for my mother. I just want to stop being afraid of my father." The line came out without preparation, like a long-stuck door finally opening. In that moment, she felt a strange shift, the decades-long nightmare stepping back by exactly one pace. Not because the past had changed, not because anyone had confessed, simply because truth, when called by its name, has the power to bring a person back into their own body. She no longer had to hold her breath at the word Catalina, no longer had to turn away when she saw the sea. She could stand and say, "My mother feared water." That night was a storm, and what happened to me was never an accident. She stressed to me as a minimal moral boundary. She tells the story of her own feelings and memories, not replacing the law, not passing judgment. The official findings still exist. In every public statement, he has never acknowledged anything. But silence is also a language, and she lived beside it too long. After recording, she drove to Westwood Memorial Park. Dusk, wet grass, the scent of freshly watered earth. She placed a white flower on her mother's grave. "Mom," she said, her hand on the cold carving. "I've spoken." Wind moved through the trees. She stood there a long time until her shadow stretched across the stone, thin as a hyphen between two generations of women, one pulled under by water and one nearly pulled under by silence. On the way home, she pulled over along the boulevard and looked west where the sun set over the Pacific. The ocean was no longer an enemy, only a vast surface reflecting the sky. She understood that pain does not disappear. It changes form from a bleeding wound to a scar that can speak. And when a scar can speak, fear grows smaller. She switched on the car light and opened the red leather notebook again. Beneath the line, "He will never let me go," she added one more in her own hand. "But I will let myself go free." Those words brought no one back, changed no case outcome, and made no man speak, but they returned to her what had been taken for 40 years, the right to have a voice. And sometimes in stories swallowed by darkness, the right to speak is itself a form of justice. 5. He stayed silent all his life. I stayed silent half of mine. That's enough. After the recording session, she left the studio in Burbank and drove toward Wilshire Boulevard. The Los Angeles afternoon fell in a soft orange light, the buildings glowing like giant candles. On the passenger seat lay the white flower she had carried since morning, a lily her mother's favorite, faint and pure as a childhood memory. She stopped at Westwood Memorial Park, where Natalie Wood had been laid to rest more than 4 decades earlier. The evening wind rustled through the palm trees, making the faded ribbons tied around the gravestones tremble. Slowly she approached, knelt, and placed the flower on the damp grass. Before the cold marble carved with Natalie Wood, 1938, 1981, she whispered, barely audible, "Mom, I've finally spoken." No voice replied, only the wind, the whisper of leaves, and from afar the faint ringing of church bells. Yet in that moment she felt as though she had opened a door that had been locked for 40 years, a door to truth, to courage, to fear, finally called by its name. Hollywood kept filming, kept shining, kept applauding its make-believe stories. Robert Wagner remained silent in his Beverly Hills mansion, where people said he spent his days staring out the window. But for the first time in 40 years, the world had heard the voice of the daughter he had tried to silence. This story, then, is no longer a case file. It is a warning about the cost of fame, the cruelty of power, and the destructive force of silence. Silence can bury the sound of waves, the sound of tears, even the sound of death, but it can never kill memory. As she left the cemetery, dusk had covered the sky. The sun sank slowly behind the palms, its fading light painting her face in a pale, ashen gold. In her hands was a photograph of Natalie, the one her father had locked away for years. It showed mother and daughter on a beach, wind tossing their hair, and Natalie's smile so radiant it seemed impossible from a woman who had always feared the water. She gazed at the photo for a long time, then smiled not out of joy, but because at last she had given her mother back the voice that had been taken. Driving away from Westwood, the car radio played a song Natalie once loved, "I Feel Pretty" from West Side Story. She didn't turn it off. The voice floated softly, dreamlike, as if from another era. In the fading light, her inner narration closed on a slow, deliberate line, "Truth may be buried." But the nightmare never ended. Because sometimes the pain of a family doesn't stop on a stormy night. It becomes the scar of an entire generation where those who keep silent still live under bright lights, and those who dare to speak pay for it with their whole lives. If you too believe that truth should never be buried beneath fame, leave a like for Natalie Wood, the woman who spent her life proving that light never dies in the dark. Share this story so more people understand that behind Hollywood's dazzling smiles lie fractures that never fully heal. And follow the channel to keep uncovering forgotten stories, the secrets that time, power, and silence once tried to hide. Because in the end, only by facing the darkness can we truly see the light.